Usually, when you walk into a courtroom, you expect to have a voice.
Right. That is just the baseline assumption.
Yeah, I mean, the entire legal system is built around the premise that you get to take the stand, you get to state your case to the judge.
You offer your context or, you bring in character witnesses.
Absolutely. Maybe you point out mitigating circumstances, or you just point fingers at someone else. We inherently expect to have the floor to defend ourselves.
You have the right to an attorney. You have the right to be heard. The presumption of innocence demands
Yeah.
that your side of the story is placed on the record before any verdict comes down.
But then you step into the theological courtroom of Jonathan Edwards, and, well, the entire paradigm just flips.
It really does. The microphone is completely cut.
Yes, the defense attorney does not even show up.
Yeah.
You are standing before a judge, and the evidence arrayed against you is so flawless and so overwhelming that you are simply silenced.
Which is a terrifying thought.
It is. Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today, we are looking at a 300-year-old legal and theological argument that attempts to prove every single human being on Earth is already on death row.
And the security footage is undeniable.
Yes, we are doing a deep dive into Jonathan Edwards' rigorous sermon, The Justice of God and the Damnation of Sinners.
It is a massive piece of historical theology, really.
It is. Our mission for this deep dive is to unpack the mechanics of Edwards' argument.
We will be looking at how he uses strict, unyielding logic and the text of Scripture to establish three main pillars.
Right, and those are comprehensive human guilt, the absolute sovereignty of the divine, and the staggering, reality-altering nature of grace.
And to you, the listener, I want to say right up front, the source material we are looking at today is heavy.
Oh, very heavy. It is going to challenge modern sensibilities about fairness, human rights, and justice.
We live in an era that prizes self-esteem and personal autonomy. And, well, Edwards is going to take a sledgehammer to both of those things.
He really does. But this text provides a crucial, historically massive perspective on Reformed theology. It is the architecture of the First Great Awakening.
It is a defining document.
Okay, let's unpack this. Where do we even begin with a text that is so uncompromising in its view of human nature?
Well, we begin right where Edwards begins, which is with a very specific strategic piece of the Apostle Paul's letter to the Romans.
Right, Romans chapter 3.
Yes, Romans chapter 3, verse 19. He anchors his entire premise right there.
And he points out that Paul's main goal in the book of Romans is to establish justification by faith alone.
Precisely. But to get to grace, Paul first has to prove that the law cannot save you.
He has to prove that no human being can be justified by their own deeds or their own resume.
Or their own heritage. And Edwards highlights how Paul systematically addresses the entire known world at that time to build this case.
Paul starts with the Gentiles in the first chapter of Romans, right?
Yeah, he does. He lays out their corruption, their idolatry, and the way they suppress the truth.
And for a Jewish reader in the first century, reading that first chapter would have elicited a lot of nodding along.
Oh, definitely. They would have agreed that the pagan world was an absolute mess.
But then Paul pivots in the second and third chapters. He turns his focus directly onto the Jewish population.
And this is where the tension really builds in the biblical text. Edwards channels all of that tension directly into his sermon.
The historical and religious context of that Jewish audience is so critical here.
It is. Edwards notes that the Jewish people of Paul's day held an incredibly high opinion of themselves.
They believed their external privileges made them pure. Right?
Yes, they had the covenant. They had the physical mark of circumcision.
They had a direct, verifiable lineage tracing all the way back to Abraham.
Right. And because they possessed these external God-given markers, they viewed the surrounding Gentiles as polluted and ignorant.
So Paul is delivering a very difficult, highly offensive message to them. He is systematically stripping away their religious armor.
He tells them that despite all their heritage, they are in the exact same legal jeopardy before the judge as the pagan Gentiles they despised.
Edwards notes that it was strange doctrine to them. I mean, they were completely insulated by their religious resumes.
They thought their standing with the Creator was just inherited.
So Paul pulls from their own law, the Old Testament text they revered, to prove that everyone is corrupt.
He quotes the Psalms, writing, "There is none righteous, no, not one."
He goes through a literal anatomy of human sin. He says the throat is an open sepulcher, the tongue uses deceit.
The poison of asps is under their lips. Their feet are swift to shed blood.
He paints a picture of universal, desperate wickedness that includes the religious elite just as much as the pagan outsider.
And Paul's conclusion, which Edwards adopts as the grounding point of his entire argument, is that the law speaks to those under the law so that every mouth may be stopped.
That phrase is so vivid. Edwards explains that the law achieves this stopping of the mouth in two specific, devastating ways.
First, it removes all boasting about personal righteousness.
You cannot point to your heritage, your baptism, or your church attendance as a plea for God's favor.
The law exposes the flaws in all of those things.
And second, it stops you from making any excuses or objections against the execution of the law's sentence.
You cannot argue against the punishment because the law has proven your guilt beyond a shadow of a doubt.
Think of it like being caught absolutely red-handed in a major crime.
Okay, lay that out for us.
Imagine a scenario where the security footage is in full 4K resolution, showing your face clearly.
Hard to argue with that.
Right, your fingerprints are all over the vault. The stolen money is found in the trunk of your car.
The evidence is piling up.
The police have a written confession in your own handwriting, and your cell phone data puts you at the scene of the crime.
The evidence is so overwhelming that you cannot offer a single rational excuse.
You cannot stand before the judge and boast about how you volunteered at a soup kitchen last Thanksgiving.
Your past good behavior is completely irrelevant to the bank robbery at hand.
You are simply silenced. The evidence demands a guilty verdict, and your mouth is physically and psychologically stopped. You have run out of words.
That is the theological reality Edwards is establishing. And this aligns entirely with the Westminster Confession.
Yes, which both of us, as Protestant Christians who hold to Reformed theology, adhere to.
The Confession teaches that man, by his fall into a state of sin, has wholly lost all ability of will to any spiritual good accompanying salvation.
This universal guilt, this complete inability to justify ourselves or excuse our behavior, is an absolute necessity.
It is the only thing that paves the way for the doctrine of justification by faith alone.
Because if you have any ground left to stand on, any excuse left to make, you will not rely entirely on the grace of God.
You will rely on that tiny sliver of your own goodness. Edwards knows that to save the soul, he first has to completely destroy its self-reliance.
So, with the mouth effectively stopped, with the defense completely dismantled, Edwards moves into the central doctrine of his sermon.
And this is a very tough pill for a modern reader to swallow.
He states, "It is just with God eternally to cast off and destroy sinners."
He bases this terrifying conclusion on two massive pillars, man's sinfulness and God's sovereignty.
Let's look at that first pillar. Edwards gets into what I can only describe as the infinite mathematics of sin.
He creates a logical formula for understanding the heinousness of a crime.
His logic here is fascinating, and it is built on a framework of objective moral realism.
He argues that the faulty nature of a crime is proportional to the obligation that has been breached.
He says this is self-evident to anyone who thinks about justice.
If you disobey someone, the severity of that disobedience depends entirely on your obligation to obey them.
And your obligation to love, honor, and obey a being is based on their loveliness, their honor, and their authority.
We need to ground this in a real-world equivalent to make sure the listener is tracking with his logic.
Good idea. Give me a scenario where the exact same action carries vastly different weight based on the target of the action.
Well, think about the judicial system we mentioned earlier. If you are walking down the sidewalk and you hurl a profane insult at a stranger, it is rude, it is aggressive.
But there are rarely any legal consequences for that. The police will not arrest you for being a jerk on the sidewalk.
Right, but if you take that exact same string of profane insults and hurl them at a federal judge in the middle of a courtroom while they're presiding over a trial, you are in trouble.
You are going to be held in contempt of court immediately. You will be placed in handcuffs and thrown in a holding cell.
The action was identical, an insult.
Yeah.
But the obligation to show respect was infinitely higher in the courtroom due to the judge's authority and the dignity of the office.
So Edwards takes this basic legal logic and scales it up to the divine level.
He scales it all the way up to infinity.
Because God is infinite in beauty, infinite in majesty, and possesses infinite authority as the creator of the universe.
So our obligation to him is infinite. We have an absolute moment-by-moment dependence on him for our very existence.
Therefore, Edwards argues, any sin against him, any violation of that infinite obligation is not just a minor infraction.
It is an infinite evil. And an infinite evil, by the strict rules of justice, deserves an infinite punishment.
What is particularly striking about this section of the sermon is the geometric analogy Edwards uses to illustrate his point.
He is trying to help a congregation of finite human beings comprehend the weight of an offense against an infinite being.
Right. He asks the listener to imagine a mathematical line.
This hypothetical line has infinite length, stretching forever in both directions. However, it has no breadth and no thickness.
In physical reality, a line with no breadth or thickness is nothing. It does not exist.
But, he argues, if that line is given any breadth at all, even a microscopic subatomic amount, and it possesses infinite length, then the total quantity of that line is infinite.
It exceeds the total volume of any finite object, no matter how broad or thick that finite object might be.
Wait, hold on. I get the courtroom analogy, and the geometry makes sense on a chalkboard. But applying infinite math to a finite human brain feels like a rigged game.
I hear you. Let push back on Edwards here. I am a finite creature. My brain physically cannot comprehend infinity.
Right, your lifespan is maybe 80 years if you are lucky.
Exactly. I mean, spot on. How is it just for a judge to punish me infinitely for a crime when I lack the capacity to fully grasp the infinite status of the one I offended?
That is the exact friction Edwards wants you to feel, and it is a common philosophical objection.
But Edwards would argue that your inability to comprehend the full scope of God's majesty does not reduce God's majesty.
Nor does it reduce your obligation. Ignorance of the full weight of the law does not exempt you from the law.
In human terms, if a person destroys a priceless, one-of-a-kind historical artifact because they thought it was just a regular piece of trash, their ignorance does not change the objective value of the thing they destroyed.
The loss is still catastrophic. Applied to sin, Edwards is saying that an offense might seem tiny to us in its breadth.
Maybe it is a fleeting jealous thought, a small lie to save face, or a moment of pride.
But because it is committed against an infinite God, it possesses one infinite dimension. The object of the offense is infinite.
Therefore, that tiny sliver of sin becomes an infinite evil, demanding a consequence that matches the status of the one offended.
So the focus shifts entirely off the sinner's intent and onto the worth of the Creator.
And this leads Edwards to address another objection that people naturally raise.
People argue that human beings are born with original corruption. We are fallen creatures, so our sinful actions are somewhat inevitable.
Right, they say it is just our nature. People try to use this unavoidable corruption to say there is no real fault in sin.
It is like blaming a dog for barking. It is just doing what it is programmed to do.
But Edwards cuts through that argument by pointing out that the light of nature teaches mankind that a voluntary injury is faulty.
Regardless of what determined the will beforehand, if you choose to do harm, you are responsible for the harm.
Even if your nature leans toward doing harm. And here's a brilliant observation Edwards makes about human hypocrisy.
He exposes how we hold a double standard when it comes to justice.
He points out that when we are wronged by someone else, we never accept their bad disposition as a valid excuse.
If someone breaks into your house and steals your belongings, or maliciously slanders your reputation to get a promotion, you do not sit back and let it go.
You do not say, well, they are naturally of a selfish, haughty temper, so I cannot blame them. It is just who they are.
No, you use their vile disposition to aggravate their crime. You say, they did this because they are a terrible, selfish, rotten person.
You demand strict accountability. But when it comes to our sins against God, we try to flip the script.
We try to point to our corrupt, fallen nature as an excuse to avoid blame.
We say, God, you know I am just a weak, flawed human. You cannot hold this against me.
We act as if our bad disposition renders us blameless before heaven, even while we use that same bad disposition to condemn our neighbors on earth.
It is a devastating critique of human logic.
We demand strict justice and severe consequences from our neighbors when they hurt us. But we demand leniency and excusing grace from our Creator,
based on the very corruption that causes our offense against him in the first place.
Edwards will not let the listener off the hook. He insists that the infinite majesty of God means that even one single sin is enough to justify eternal condemnation.
But he does not stop at one sin. This brings us to the sheer volume of human guilt.
It is not just one infinite offense. It is a lifetime of them.
He moves from the mathematical abstract theory of infinite sin to the practical, crushing reality of total depravity.
When Reformed theology speaks of total depravity, it requires careful definition.
It does not mean utter depravity. It does not mean that every person is as thoroughly evil in their actions as they possibly could be.
We all know people who are not Christians who do genuinely kind things.
Total depravity means that the corruption of sin extends to every single part of human nature. There's no faculty left untouched.
Edwards articulates this vividly. He says the understanding is darkened, the will is perverse, and the affections are disordered.
He categorizes the physical senses, seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, as mere inlets and outlets for sin.
They are channels of corruption. The head and the heart are entirely depraved.
He argues that there is pride, enmity, contempt, atheism, and blasphemy residing in the human heart with exceeding strength.
Even if society keeps those impulses somewhat in check.
And he confronts his congregation with an exhaustive, brutal inventory of their actual daily behavior.
He talks about a life filled with sin, days and nights filled up with sin.
He calls out wasted time, hours spent on trivialities while ignoring the eternal state of the soul.
He calls out those who mock their parents. And he uses a very specific, terrifying biblical warning for that one.
He references Proverbs chapter 30, verse 17, right?
Yes. That proverb warns that the eye that mocks a father and refuses to obey a mother will be picked out by the ravens of the valley and eaten by young eagles.
It is a visceral, horrifying image of nature turning against the rebellious child.
He calls out malice and revenge against neighbors. He calls out sensual indulgence, lust, and lasciviousness.
He does not deal in vague, abstract categories. He brings the conviction right down to the specific daily lives of the people sitting in front of him.
He confronts their covetousness, their inordinate love of the world, their obsession with land and money.
He notes how they neglect reading the scriptures, how they skip praying, and how they abandon meditation just to pursue worldly vanities.
He points out their pride, how they vaunt themselves in their apparel, showing off their clothes or their riches.
And how it actually gulls them, how it causes them physical pain to see others succeed or be praised above them.
There is a phrase he uses in this section that really caught my attention.
Oh, which one?
When describing the covetous person, a person drowning their soul in worldly cares and financial anxiety, he calls them a mere earthworm.
He says they are an earthworm that is never in its element, but when groveling and buried in the dirt.
It is such a stripping, humbling image.
Edwards is basically looking at a congregation of New England Puritans, people whose idea of a wild Friday night was probably reading the Psalms by candlelight.
And he is calling them earthworms groveling in the dirt.
You have to imagine the absolute pin-drop silence in that room.
He is taking all the things we build our self-esteem on, our clothes, our jobs, our social standing, our bank accounts, and reducing it all to a worm writhing in the mud.
It forces a huge personal reckoning.
If we look at the overarching purpose of the sermon, Edwards wants to ensure no one sitting in the pews can retreat into a fortress of perceived innocence.
He asks the listener to consider the things done alone, the things done in the dark when no human eye could see.
He talks about unclean imaginations, the silent thoughts we would be terrified for anyone else to know.
He talks about fraudulent business dealings, cutting corners at work, and the neglect of secret prayer.
He even calls out hypocrisy in worship. He talks about people who come to the Lord's table, who take communion, while harboring malice and envy in their hearts toward the person sitting 3 pews away.
After laying all of this out, he asks a crushing rhetorical question.
After behaving this way, with this kind of internal and external record, are you not ashamed to talk of it being hard for God to cast you off?
Does it become a person with this kind of rap sheet to open their mouth and complain against God's justice?
He builds this mountain of guilt, heaped up to heaven, to prove his first pillar. Man's sinfulness makes condemnation just.
If the math of infinity does not convince you, the sheer volume of your daily rebellion will.
But then he shifts to the second pillar of his doctrine, the absolute sovereignty of God.
And this is where the Reformed perspective really sharpens and defines itself against other theological traditions.
Yes, Edwards outlines the scope of God's sovereign power and his divine right.
He begins with a premise that confronts human entitlement directly, and it is a premise that makes modern readers very uncomfortable.
He states that God was under no obligation to keep angels or men from falling.
God could, in his sovereign providence, permit them to sin. He was not required to put up a safety net.
Because if God were obligated to prevent sin, what happens to the concept of moral government?
It becomes completely useless.
Edwards argues that if God makes a reasonable creature, gives them a law, and subjects them to a system of moral government, but is simultaneously obligated to make it impossible for them to break that law, the whole system collapses into absurdity.
What is the point of giving commands, making promises, or issuing threatenings if the creature knows God is forced to prevent them from failing?
In that scenario, the lawgiver is the one who is actually under the law.
It becomes God's required duty to ensure obedience, rather than the creature's responsibility to obey.
There would be an end to all divine authority over the creature. God would be a hostage to his own creation.
So God permits sin, But Edwards is very careful to clarify that this permission is not random. It is not an accident.
The certainty of the fall was ordered by infinite wisdom.
That is a crucial theological distinction.
Edwards addresses the philosophical idea of chance. He argues that leaving an event of such massive cosmic consequence to blind, undesigning chance is absurd.
It is infinitely preferable that such a consequential event be disposed and ordered by infinite wisdom.
Even if someone argues that God should have left it entirely to man's free will without any divine ordering or decree, Edwards counters that.
He says the very first motion of that free will, unguided by anything, would still be a matter of mere contingency,
Which he equates to blind chance.
He maintains that God's wise disposal by permission does not infringe on the creature's liberty any more than blind chance would.
But it ensures that the outcome serves a greater, infinitely wise purpose.
This brings us to a concept that is central to Reformed theology, but often misunderstood and heavily criticized: federal headship.
Edwards tackles why humanity fell as a whole. Why are we all implicated in Adam's choice?
Let me phrase the objection the way most people feel it. Wait a minute, why am I on the hook for a guy who ate a piece of fruit thousands of years ago?
Right, I was not there. I did not vote for him.
Yeah, how is it just that his failure corrupts my nature?
That is the most common objection to the doctrine of original sin.
Federal headship is the teaching that Adam was appointed by God as the moral and legal representative for all mankind.
He was the head of the human race, not just biologically, but legally.
Edwards defends this appointment as entirely fitting for divine wisdom.
He argues that God had the sovereign right to determine whether every single person should stand trial for themselves,
Or whether the first father of mankind should represent the rest.
and Edwards says that appointing Adam was not injurious to mankind.
He challenges the listener to find any reason in the nature of things why it would have been better for each of us to stand for ourselves.
Adam was created perfect in an ideal environment with full knowledge of the consequences.
If he failed in paradise, what makes us think we would do any better in our own individual trials?
Since there is no inherent advantage to standing trial individually, mankind is not wronged by God choosing a representative.
It was a sovereign, wise appointment. Furthermore, if we reject the concept of federal headship in Adam, we destroy the mechanism for salvation.
We cannot claim the imputed righteousness of Christ, the second Adam, if we reject the concept of representation altogether.
Okay, let's look at this from another angle. I think a lot of listeners might ask about the mechanics of redemption here.
Right. How does that work if we are all fallen?
If God established this federal headship and Adam fell, pulling everyone down into a state of total depravity where they are completely unable to save themselves, does God have to offer a lifeline?
If the system God set up resulted in universal ruin, doesn't fairness dictate that he steps in to fix what broke?
Doesn't he owe humanity a way out?
That is the natural human reaction. We
Yeah.
want God to balance the scales.
But Edwards firmly relies on the text and the strict legal logic he has already built.
His answer to that question is a definitive, unyielding no.
Redemption is entirely at God's sovereign pleasure.
When men are fallen, corrupt, and sinful, God has the absolute right to determine about their redemption as he pleases.
He is under no obligation to anyone.
He could have left all humanity to perish, just as he left the fallen angels to perish without a savior.
He could redeem all of humanity. Or he may redeem some and leave others to the justice they deserve.
Because to say God must save anyone is a contradiction of everything established in the first half of the sermon.
That is the logical bedrock of his argument.
To suppose that a sinner has forfeited God's favor, broken an infinite obligation, and deserves to perish, but then to claim God is obligated not to let them perish, implies the sinner still has a valid claim to favor.
You cannot be justly condemned by the law and simultaneously hold a legal right to be pardoned. It is a logical impossibility.
A pardon, by definition, is unmerited. God is the sovereign possessor of heaven and earth.
He is absolutely perfect, the fountain of all wisdom, and it is fitting that he determines everything by his own will, without asking counsel of any creature.
If God is entirely justified in casting us off, how does this actually play out?
Does he just throw everyone into a generic fire, or does the punishment fit the crime?
Edwards moves into the application portion of his sermon, where he addresses the sinners in the congregation who are actively afraid of damnation.
He wants to convince them that their potential damnation is not just legally correct on paper, but it is poetically just in practice.
He introduces the concept of mutual answerableness, or similitude.
He argues that if God eternally casts a sinner off, the nature of that rejection will be an exact terrifying reflection of how the sinner behaved during their life.
It is not just equality of punishment. It is a mirror image of the offense.
He breaks this similitude down into four devastating categories.
The first category is the sinner's treatment of God.
Edwards points out that the natural person has never exercised the least degree of true love to God.
They have never rejoiced in God's happiness. They do not care about God's glory.
If their own private interests are met, if they have money, health, and comfort, they are perfectly content to see God's honor dragged through the mud.
So Edwards asks a penetrating question. Why should God be obligated to express wonderful, unspeakable love to you when you have never loved him?
Why should God care for your eternal welfare when you have never cared for his glory?
He notes how the sinner has continually slighted God's majesty.
God calls through the preaching of the word, God commands through the conscience, and the sinner brushes it off as if the honor of the infinite king is worth less than the dirt under their feet.
And then there is the abuse of mercy.
God provides food, he provides preservation from danger, he grants recoveries from sickness, and he gives continued days of grace.
And what does the sinner do with these gifts? They use the physical strength provided by God's food to continue rebelling against him.
That specific point, presuming on God's mercy to continue sinning, is identified by Edwards as a uniquely heinous affront.
There is a base ingratitude in being worse to God simply because he is infinitely good.
Edwards notes that sinners often hear about God's boundless grace, and they use that theological truth as a license to venture into greater wickedness, thinking they can just ask for pardon later.
It is a calculated manipulation of divine goodness. To abuse the very attribute of divine mercy is to provoke justice to its highest degree.
How righteous would it be, Edwards argues, if God ordered it so that such a person never receives the eternal benefit of the mercy they so casually abused in life?
The second category of similitude is the sinner's treatment of Jesus Christ.
Edwards says that if God casts you off, it is perfectly agreeable to how you treated the Savior, because the reality is the natural man rejects Christ.
Now, I know people will immediately object to that statement.
They will say, wait, I am terrified of hell. I would give anything to have Christ as my Savior. I am praying for it every night.
But Edwards makes a brilliant, piercing psychological distinction here. He distinguishes between wanting to escape punishment and actually wanting Christ.
This is a crucial diagnostic tool in Reformed pastoral care. You can love the deliverance without loving the deliverer.
Edwards points out that the inclination of the natural will terminates entirely on self-preservation. You do not want to burn. That is natural.
Every animal has a survival instinct.
But a survival instinct does not mean your heart is closing with Christ and saving faith.
A forced compliance driven solely by the terror of the flames is not the free, willing, affectionate acceptance that Christ seeks as a bridegroom seeking a bride.
Edwards uses a powerful analogy to clarify this dynamic.
He asks us to imagine a condemned man in a kingdom. The king sentences this man to a tormenting, gruesome death.
But the man believes the sentence is fundamentally unjust. He thinks he is innocent, or at least that the punishment is way too harsh for his minor crimes.
Now, if the king offers a pardon to this man as an act of great grace and clemency, the condemned man cannot truly accept it as an act of grace.
He can take the piece of paper to save his skin, but in his heart, he believes he was injured by the king in the first place.
He sees the pardon as a late correction of an injustice, not a free gift of unmerited favor.
Because accepting Christ as a savior from the desert of hell requires acknowledging that you actually deserve hell.
If you are not deeply convinced of your massive guilt, if you still think you are a generally good person who just made some mistakes, the offer of a bloody atonement is almost an insult.
It implies a charge of cosmic treason you do not believe you committed.
Furthermore, Edwards points out that sinners demonstrate they do not truly want Christ because they do not trust his sufficiency or his faithfulness.
He uses the analogy of a leaky ship to illustrate this lack of trust.
A man in distressing fear, standing on a dock, will not willingly venture out into a violent ocean in a ship he suspects is going to sink.
He might be afraid of what is on land, but he won't trust the boat.
In the same way, sinners under conviction often despair because they do not actually believe Christ's blood is sufficient to cover their massive, infinite guilt.
They have too mean an opinion of him. Or conversely, they secretly want to hold on to their own goodness, their own religious resume.
And they resent a way of salvation that sets their personal achievements at zero. They want to be co-saviors.
The third category of similitude is the treatment of others.
Edwards argues that casting off the sinner is answerable to how they have treated their fellow human beings.
He points out how often people are secretly opposed to the salvation of others. They envy those who receive grace.
They begrudge their neighbor's spiritual success, much like the older brother in the parable of the prodigal son,
Who was furious that his wayward sibling received a feast while he, the dutiful son, got nothing.
Or they actively promote the ruin of others. They set bad examples, they lead companions into sin, or they neglect the spiritual education of their own children.
They provide food for their kids' bodies, they send them to good schools, but they starve their souls by never teaching them about God.
Edwards flips the script. If you have shown no regard for the eternal state of your own family or your neighbors, why should God be bound to exercise infinite mercy toward your eternal state?
And finally, the fourth category is the treatment of self. The sinner has been wildly, recklessly careless with their own soul.
They refuse to deny themselves minor physical pleasures or take any pains for their eternal welfare.
They obstinately persist in paths that lead to destruction, fighting against God's warnings, the pleading of their pastors, and the prickings of their own conscience.
Edwards says, if you insist on drinking poison in contempt of the physician's advice, who can you blame when you perish?
If you willfully, stubbornly run into the fire against all restraints, you must blame yourself when you are burned.
The damnation of the sinner is nothing more than God finally giving them what they insisted on having all along.
So Edwards has painted the sinner into an absolute, inescapable corner.
The math condemns them, the volume of their sin condemns them, God's sovereignty offers no required safety net, and the punishment is a perfect reflection of their own choices.
But he knows his audience. He knows the human mind is a factory for excuses.
The moment we feel trapped, we start looking for a loophole.
So he spends the next section of the sermon dismantling the specific objections he knows are rising in the hearts of his listeners right in that moment.
The first objection is the classic plea of inability. I would if I could. I want to be saved, but I cannot make myself willing to accept Christ.
Edwards tears this down by locating the exact source of the inability. The inability lies entirely in a perverse will.
If a person were genuinely willing to do something, but found they lacked the physical or circumstantial ability to carry it out, that might be a valid excuse.
For example, if you want to save a drowning man, but you are paralyzed and cannot swim, your physical inability excuses you.
But in salvation, the defect is in the will itself. The sinner has no sincere desire to be willing.
Edwards asks, if a man hates you deeply, walks up to you and strikes you in the face, but then says, I hated you so much I couldn't help choosing to hit you, does that excuse him?
No, the depth of his hatred aggravates the offense. His inability to love you is the very crime he is guilty of.
And Edwards adds that a forced willingness is worthless.
If you say you would make yourself willing if you could, but that desire is only driven by the sheer terror of hell, the exact same fear a demon has when contemplating the lake of fire, it possesses no moral goodness.
A first hypocritical inclination, manufactured under duress, cannot be offered to a holy God as an excuse for genuine, lifelong rebellion.
The second major objection Edwards anticipates is a grievance against God's selective grace.
The sinner looks around the congregation or looks at history and says, God shows mercy to others who have done the exact same things I have, or even worse.
Right. Why did he save Paul, who murdered Christians, but not me? Why not me? This is a very common human reaction when faced with the doctrine of election and sovereign grace. We feel slighted.
And Edwards responds with what we can call the debt argument.
He makes it exceedingly clear. God is not in debt to anyone.
If God bestows grace on a notoriously wicked person, he does so out of his own sovereign pleasure to display the magnitude of his mercy.
Giving an unmerited gift to one person does not put God in debt to another person.
He references the parable in Matthew chapter 20, verse 15, where the master of the vineyard pays the late workers the same as the early workers.
When the early workers complain, the master asks, is it not lawful for me to do what I will with my own? Grace is God's property to distribute as he sees fit.
He challenges the listener's view of God's autonomy.
Must the great God be tied up, unable to make a free gift of his grace without creating a binding obligation to everyone else in the universe?
A human being has the right to give their money to whoever they choose. You can leave your estate to one charity and ignore another, and no one calls you unjust.
Why do we deny the Creator the same absolute property rights over his own grace?
Edwards highlights a cutting irony here, returning to the hypocrisy of the human heart.
The sinner complains that God shows more respect to others than to them. They feel their dignity has been insulted.
But Edwards points out that the sinner has shown more respect to the devil, to worldly wealth, and to vile lusts than they ever showed to God.
You chose to honor worthless things, base things, over the infinite creator.
Where is the injustice if God chooses to set his love on others and reject you, when you have spent your entire life rejecting him for lesser things?
And he concludes this section on objections by addressing the mystery of God's secret decrees.
People often try to blame predestination for their sin, saying, if God decreed it, I have no choice.
He tells the congregation that objecting to God's decrees is unreasonable because those decrees do not alter human liberty in real time.
Let the secret counsels of God be what they will. Your constant daily experience teaches you that you do what you choose to do.
No one forces you to lie. No one forces you to covet. Your conscience charges you with vile dispositions and base behavior toward God.
The secret things belong to the Lord, but your willful rebellion is your own, and it leaves you entirely without excuse.
That is a staggering place to leave a congregation.
If the sermon ended there, it would be a portrait of unmitigated despair.
The mouth is stopped. The guilt is mathematically infinite. The sovereignty of God is absolute. The similitude of punishment is perfectly poetic, and every single excuse has been systematically dismantled.
There is nowhere left to hide.
But this brings us to the final movement of the sermon, the gospel turn. Edwards pivots to ensure the doctrine does not leave the listener in absolute darkness.
Having crushed their self-reliance, he now points them to the only actual hope.
This is where the framework of Reformed theology shines brightest.
The bad news is as bad as it can possibly be, which makes the good news genuinely astounding, rather than just a polite offer of assistance.
Edwards transitions to the sufficiency of grace.
He tells the terrified sinner that while it would be entirely righteous and just for God to cast them off forever, it would also be just for God to save them in and through Christ.
How can it be just to save the guilty? That seems to contradict the earlier point about strict justice.
If a judge lets a guilty murderer go free just because the judge feels nice, we call that a corrupt judge.
It is just because complete satisfaction for all sin has been made. God has set forth Christ to be a propitiation.
We need to break down that word propitiation. It is essentially a theological way of describing a wrath-absorbing sponge.
It is not just overlooking a crime. It is a full transfer of the penalty. The law is not ignored. The law is fulfilled.
The blood of Christ is so precious, so valuable, that it is fully sufficient to pay the massive infinite debt contracted by the sinner.
It perfectly vindicates the divine majesty from all the dishonor cast upon it by human rebellion.
Edwards makes a claim here that is almost hard to comprehend.
He says it was a greater thing for Christ to die than for all mankind to burn in hell to all eternity. Let that sink in.
The execution of the Son of God on a Roman cross outside Jerusalem carries more weight in the scales of cosmic justice than the eternal conscious torment of billions of human beings.
The logic rests on Orthodox Christology. It is based on the infinite dignity and excellency of Christ.
Because the person suffering on the cross is the infinite eternal Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, his temporary suffering possesses infinite value.
He compresses an eternity of infinite punishment into a finite window of time because of who he is.
Therefore, God is willing to be at peace with sinners. He can show mercy not just kindly, but honorably.
He does not sweep the sin under the rug. The penalty is fully absorbed by a substitute of infinite worth.
The justice of God is satisfied, and the love of God is poured out simultaneously.
But Edwards maintains his rigorous guardrails even in the offer of grace. This mercy is strictly through Christ.
It is not because of any religious performances, prayers, or tears the sinner offers.
God will show mercy solely on Christ's account and according to his sovereign pleasure. He cannot be brought under obligation by human works.
You cannot buy this grace with your repentance.
Yet, the invitation is thrown wide open. There is enough in Christ for the vilest sinner in the congregation.
If the debt is paid by an infinite treasury, it does not matter how overdrawn your account is.
Edwards finishes by addressing the godly, those who have already received this grace and have been justified by faith.
He calls them to remember their origins. They were precisely the same as the condemned.
They had the same wicked hearts, the same enmity toward God, the same stubborn refusal to hear his calls.
They abused his mercy and rejected his Son.
Yet God magnified his free grace toward them, not because they were better, but because he is merciful.
He quotes Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 63, which perfectly encapsulates the emotional reality of Reformed theology.
The realization of this sovereign free grace should cause the believer to be confounded.
The text says, "That thou mayest remember and be confounded, and never open thy mouth any more because of thy shame, when I am pacified toward thee for all that thou hast done."
This brings the entire argument full circle. The law stops the mouth of the sinner in terror and conviction. They have no defense.
But the gospel stops the mouth of the believer in awe and humility. They have no boast.
Self-justification is replaced with a permanent posture of lowliness and continual praise for the sovereign mercy that made them to differ from others.
So let's recap the progression of this deep dive.
We started in the courtroom of Romans 3, where the evidence of universal guilt stops every mouth from boasting or making excuses.
We examine the terrifying mathematics of infinite sin, where a finite creature breaching an infinite obligation creates a debt that demands infinite punishment.
We walked through the crushing mountain of total depravity, cataloging the visceral secret sins that prove our corruption.
We establish the absolute sovereignty of God, who is under no obligation to save those who have willfully rebelled.
We analyzed the poetic justice of condemnation, seeing how casting off the sinner is a perfect mirror of how the sinner treated God, Christ, others, and themselves.
We watched Edwards systematically dismantle every human excuse, proving that our inability is rooted in a perverse will, not unfair circumstances.
And finally, we arrived at the staggering sufficiency of Christ's sacrifice, a substitute of such infinite dignity that God can honorably justify the ungodly without compromising his justice.
It is a theological structure of immense weight. It forces a complete abandonment of self-reliance and drives the soul entirely onto the provision of Christ.
Edwards forces us to look at the absolute bottom of our depravity to understand the heights of grace.
But here's something to mull over today, a final provocative thought to take with you.
If we truly accepted Edwards' premise that God owes us absolutely nothing, not even our next breath, let alone eternal salvation, how would that change our modern culture of entitlement?
If you woke up tomorrow believing every single comfort, every beat of your heart, was an unmerited gift from a judge you had offended, rather than a basic human right, would you even recognize your own life?
How much of our daily anxiety, our anger, and our bitterness is rooted in the secret belief that we deserve better than we are getting?
Does your daily posture reflect a stopped mouth, struck silent by the staggering weight of unmerited grace?
Or, if you look closely at your heart, are you still standing in the courtroom, secretly trying to hand the judge your resume? Thank you for joining us on Reformed Thinking. Keep analyzing the texts that shape your faith.